Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everyone for this beautiful Sunday. We have the third lecture of SIGA's Ramadan webinar series today. And we have a very exciting speaker today in the program. This is Dr. Dalia Fahmy from the States. And I will just shortly introduce her before she will start her presentation. She will have a PowerPoint that she will then share with you guys. And at the end, we will have a question and answer session. And yes, by the way, this is Linda Hyökki. I am also a non-resident research associate at SIGA. And I hope that I can do my best today to be your host. So yeah, Dr. Dalia Fahmy, she's an associate professor of political science at Long Island University, where she teaches courses on US foreign policy, world politics, international relations, military and defense policy, causes of war, and politics of the Middle East. Dr. Fahmy is currently also a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. Now, I will give the floor to Dr. Dalia, and yeah, inshallah, she will start her presentation. Enjoy.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Allow me to please take a moment to thank Istanbul Zion University and the Center for Islam and Global Affairs and their staff for hosting me today. Thank you so much, Linda, for the introduction and for moderating the session. And a special thanks to Dr. Fahmy, the founder and director of the program, for including me in what looks like a wonderful 30-day series of very important topics in both domestic and political affairs throughout the world. I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint presentation. Can you see it in full?
Yes, we can see it, Dr. Dalia.
Okay, great. So I'm going to begin the presentation with asking a series of questions. And while the topic for today is about COVID-19, the rise of the alt-right in the United States, the rise of the alt-right is also a global phenomenon. COVID-19 is a global phenomenon, and the mainstreaming of Islamophobia is also a global phenomenon. But I'm going to focus on it in the United States in particular, and then extrapolate from it at the end. But what does that really mean? And I'm going to begin with a series of questions. What explains the rise of and decline of anti-Muslim sentiment? It's actually not a constant, right? There are peaks and there are ebbs. And so the question is, does it function in cycles, right? Why is it that there are critical junctures where there is a rise and then there is a decline? Similarly, what explains the rise of the alt-right? And we're going to define all these terms in a few minutes. Does it function in cycles? And the reason why I asked that question is that it seems to be increasing, right? It's not functioning the same secular pattern as anti-Muslim sentiment or Islamophobia. And the greater question for today is, what can COVID-19, the response of the alt-right, and rising anti-Muslim sentiment tell us about the coming year, 2020, and election year, but more critically for the future of American democracy? And I'm being very deliberate with my language here. I have piles of books around me that ask questions about the Middle East, North Africa, Muslim majority societies, and with every question there is, and what does this mean for democracy in the region? And what does this mean for the future of liberalism? And I want to ask us why we don't question the same way narratives that are rising in the West, not just in the United States, but in the West as a whole. And so I'm asking this very deliberately. What does it mean for the future of American democracy? What does it mean for the future of liberalism? What does it mean for the future of conservatism or neoconservatism? So let's begin. What do we know? what signaled my entry into this research was this critical moment that began in 2015 during the Republican primaries, during the run-up to the 2016 U.S. election. During the Republican primaries, there was an extreme uptick in anti-Muslim violence. According to CNN, that one year, 2015, there were 63 incidents of attacks on mosques in the United States, the highest number ever, leading CNN to say that this was one of the most intensely anti-Muslim time periods in American history. The Southern Poverty Law Center, the FBI, the ACLU, and the ADC all found that 2015 was extremely anti-Muslim as a time period. And it wasn't just the desecration of mosques and Muslim community spaces, but also physical attacks on Muslims and Muslim-looking men and women. Sikh men who wear turbans were particularly targeted. Muslim women who wear the hijab or head covering or veil were attacked much more than men. And it seems that the symbols of Islam in the United States, mosques, community centers, men in turbans and women in hijabs or headscarves, were being particularly targeted as part of this larger pattern of the dehumanization of Muslims. Fear of Islam has become more and more prominent in everyday Muslim discourse. From nationwide anti-Islam rallies, the controversies that surround the several mosque zonings, illegal surveillance of Muslim student organizations, attempts to pass anti-Sharia legislation, the vitriol that came out of that Republican primary, where language included, can Muslims be trusted? Can Muslims in office be trusted? And it seemed that in this uptick, there was a direct result on the Muslim community. In that year, 2015, according to Gallup, 48% of Muslim Americans said that they experienced racial or religious discrimination. In essence, 50% of Muslim Americans felt discriminated against. And unfortunately, we saw in that year the end result of this with the execution-style murders of 3 young people in North Carolina, the burning down of an Islamic school in Houston, when 2 people in Michigan were asked if they were Muslim and they responded in the affirmative, they were stabbed repeatedly. 2 imams were stabbed and killed in the Bronx, New York. Political campaigns included slogans that this is a Judeo-Christian nation, meaning that Islam had no place here, and that Muslims should not be included in cabinet or electoral positions, and that the definition of America should fundamentally exclude Islam and Muslims. For me, this took a critical juncture in 2015 when, during the State of the Union address, and for non-Americans, the president is tasked with delivering a State of the Union, what is the State of the United States, address to the public. And it is held in the Chamber of Congress, where all of members of Congress, both the House and the Senate, Supreme Court justices, members of the cabinet, everyone is present. And in that 2015 address, President Obama stands up and says that this is a country that is facing rising anti-Semitic sentiment, and we will stand against it. And every single member of Congress stands up and applauds that, rightfully so. In that same address, in the next breath, President Obama says that this is also a country that will stand against rising anti-Muslim sentiment, and the entire chamber falls silent. It seemed that for the first time, what we had been talking about, that anti-Muslim sentiment was in the periphery, was now in the heart of the political establishment. And that is Islamophobia. We tend to talk about Islamophobia or anti-Muslim sentiment as the dislike or prejudice against Islam and Muslims. It's actually much deeper than that. According to the Council on American Islamic Relations and according to the report published Fear Inc., Islamophobia is an exaggerated fear, hatred, and hostility towards Islam and Muslims that perpetuates negative stereotypes that has an objective. And the objective is the marginalization and exclusion of Muslims from civic and political life. Yes, there's a political objective here, that the hatred, the hostility, the hysteria around Islam and Muslims exists, that permeates into greater society, but also permeates into the Muslim community itself, where Muslims see themselves as outside of civic and political life. Now, so Islamophobia has an objective, so it's not random. How do we see this? So, for example, there's a certain talk show pundit that for quite a while would say 40% of Muslims worldwide support terrorism. Now, if there are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, then for that statistic to be true, 720 million Muslims would have to support terrorism. 720 million. Now, if we look at the population of Tunisia, 11 million, Morocco, 35, Libya, 6, Jordan, 8, Indonesia, 264, Malaysia, 31, Pakistan, 197, add to that 172 million Muslims in India, that would basically equate to that one statistic. Now, we know that all of the countries that I mentioned are those that have had democratic revolutions, democratic elections, who have fought for some essence of democracy, who have not in any way encompassed the sheer number of 40% of Muslims, 40% of Muslims supporting terrorism. So this is a fundamental falsehood. But when falsehoods get repeated, it leads to that hysteria that leads to the marginalization. The second one, a conservative pundit named Ben Shapiro, and he's editor-at-large of the conservative website Breitbart. Breitbart is something that will come into play in a few more minutes. It's a conservative so-called media analysis group that was founded by Bannon. In this statistic, he says that 76% of Muslims are radical. He repeats consistently through Truth Revolt, another website, 76% of Muslims are radical. However, what he's doing is misinterpreting a Pew study done on Muslims and Muslim majority countries that asks citizens, this is the question, do you want religious courts or religious judges to decide family and property disputes? Now, the Pew question is, do you want religious courts or religious judges deciding family and property disputes only for Muslims? In the country of Pakistan, 76% of Pakistanis say yes, they want religious courts or religious judges deciding family and property disputes for Muslims. For Shapiro, that equals support for Sharia, which equals radical. 76% of Muslims want Sharia law. In all Muslim countries, Pakistan has 179 million Muslims. Therefore, it's another 135.4 million radicals. This is a fundamental false statistic. 76% of Muslims are radical is something that has been reported by Ben Shapiro over and over. It's been picked up in different media outlets. And it's this falsehood, again, built on a Pew study that asks, do you want religious judges and courts deciding property disputes, family or property disputes for Muslims only? 76% of people in Pakistan said yes. And this comes to 76% of Muslims are radical. Again, 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. The insinuation was used last year. Last year, just around this time in April last year, there's a congressional hearing called Hate Crimes and the Rise of White Nationalism. And one individual was, as a Muslim, was asked to testify in that congressional hearing. Dr. Abu Salha was asked to testify. He's the father of 2 daughters and his son-in-law who were killed execution style in North Carolina because they are Muslim. Yet in that hearing, Dr. Abu Salha was not asked about his children. He was repeatedly asked about his Muslim faith and forced to defend his Muslim faith. For example, Representative Jackson Lee of Texas, after offering her sympathies to the doctor, asked him, "Did you teach your children and your daughters hatred?" He says to her, "Absolutely not, Congresswoman. We definitely made sure that anybody who is racist or hateful is out and speaking about his masjid," because he was a board member at the masjid. She follows up, "So the very fact of being Muslim, you're not filling children or those in the mosque with hatefulness?" "We actually fight this," he says. Another representative asks him, Johnson from Georgia. Again, he offers his condolences, but he doesn't ask him about the murder of his children. He asks him, "Does Islam teach Muslims to hate Jewish people?" Dr. Abu Salha responds by saying, "Actually, in the Quran, it says that killing any human being is akin to killing humanity, and reviving the soul is akin to reviving humanity." Again, this is a congressional hearing on hate crimes and the rise of white nationalism. This is a father that lost 2 daughters to white nationalism. It took 3 hours before Abu Salha was asked his opinion on the matter relevant to the hearing topic. He had been defending the faith of Islam. Islam being a suspect religion, even in a hearing on the rise of white nationalism, to a father who lost 2 daughters to white nationalism. So this takes me to the heart of my study or my research, where how does this mainstreaming happen? What used to be in the periphery now coming into the core of the political establishment. And I argue that what was once in the fringes comes to the core through the tracking of Muslim sentiment in the run-up to an election. It's a full frontal strategy where fear is used for electoral victory. And it leads to the mainstreaming of anti-Muslim sentiment and leading to a dichotomous relationship of Islam and Muslims on one hand and American society and American values on the other, an us versus them dichotomy. The gradual and extensive shift of anti-Muslim rhetoric from the margins of American life to its political mainstream is the product of the symbiotic relationship that I outline right here. It's a network of anti-Muslim interest groups and a corresponding faction of willing politicians who are running for office and need support, coupled with certain media outlets. So you have interest groups, media outlets, and political figures all in this tripartite symbiotic relationship. Now, 2010 was a crescendo year of this nativist Muslim trend, and that's because of the 2008 election of President Obama. In 2008, we saw that what were once localized rumors on the internet being turned into national talk show-worthy discussions, all of them representations of the worst kinds of conspiracies that we had seen. 2010 was a climax of this, and the trend was not simply about how the Islamophobic network works, but about how it can actually foment hatred and fear. Beyond the electoral success that many had derived from these episodes of American hysteria, the conclusion of this research project that the main victim of such a prejudiced political movement has been the tenor and the climate of politics in the United States and its mainstreaming of anti-Muslim sentiment, particularly around elections and particularly within the Republican Party. So I'm going to look at several elections, but because of time, I won't discuss all of them. I'll discuss 2008, 2010, 2016, 18, and then the 2020 presidential election. But I'll focus a lot more on the 2016 presidential election of President Trump, but I want to foreground it in what happened in 2008. So in 2008, there was a political opening that happened for President Obama, or the run-up to the election of President Obama. His candidacy was a kind of opening for a network of right-wing groups to ally themselves with increasingly more radical wings, refueling and fueling anti-Muslim rhetoric. The anti-Muslim rhetoric was an attempt to counter the internationalist appeal of Obama as he was running for office, combined with his non-white skin, symbolizing a new chapter in the American evolution that figures into the conservative movement and that everything that they were fearing. Rumors of the president's religion, his beliefs, through the cumulative effort of several organized processes, began to make their way from the margins of America to the mainstream. Basically what I'm arguing, the candidacy of Barack Hussein Obama, was the ultimate fear nexus coming into the United States. A black man, child of an immigrant, who has a very Muslim last name, whose father was a Muslim, is a presidential candidate in the United States. It was a multi-pronged approach. The documentary film Obsession, Radical Islam's War Against the West, was distributed to more than 28 million voters in swing states. Rumors of President Obama, or then candidate Obama's Islamic/Muslim faith, had been around since he made the keynote speech in 2004 at the DNC, but the matter became an actual election cycle issue for many, prompting his campaign to launch the now defunct FightTheSmears.com, which clarified everything from smears regarding his religion to the so-called birther conspiracies. The matter was indicative of a deeper anti-Muslim sentiment, since the idea of a Muslim president seemed threatening to the U.S. national identity. Again, you couldn't use the language of race and the first black man, but you could definitely foment fear around the suspect citizen of possible ties to being Muslim. In January of 2007, a year before the election, Insight magazine, again a now defunct outlet owned by the right-wing Washington Times, published a story that cited how associates of the Hillary campaign were able to unearth evidence that Obama had, from the age of 6 to 8, attended a Wahhabi-oriented madrasa. Again, this was a hysteria around him actually attending a school in Indonesia. But the word madrasa led to hysteria that he was Wahhabi. The rumor was substantiated and moved into the Fox News Glenn Beck program before finally a CNN journalist went to Indonesia and found that indeed he had just been at school. Eric Stakelbeck, a personality on right-wing evangelical networks who once worked as a senior writer and analyst on Steve Emerson's notoriously anti-Muslim investigative Muslim project on terrorism, often wrote about how the U.S. is being Arabized and Islamized by Muslims in the run-up to this election. So we started to see, again, this nexus of individuals, money, and media outlets fomenting the fear around candidate Obama, because there was the beginning of the change in the United States, the real symbolic change. 2010, midterm congressional elections. So in the United States, there's presidential elections every 4 years, but in between them, every 2 years, there's midterm elections where a section of Congress is up for re-election. 2010, again, a crescendo year. Here is a year that marks 1 year into the rise of the Tea Party, which I'll talk more about later. 2010, in the summer, up to the run-up to the election, we started to see new issues rise to foment fear around Islam and Muslims to change the outcome of the midterm congressional elections. Two parallel events helped frame this relationship between members of groups in the Islamophobia network and their willing Republican politicians. The first was the Ground Zero Mosque hysteria and the national campaign to ban Sharia law at the state level. Now, in December of 2009, the New York Times published a front-page story on the approval of the Cordoba project. Or Park 51. This was a community center that was originally founded with the idea of celebrating the multiculturalism of Muslim contribution in the United States. However, Pamela Geller, another right-wing writer, wrote in her blog, Atlas Shrugged, the same day that there was a victory mosque going up to 9/11. And she referred to the project as the Ground Zero Mosque. And this term would catch fever throughout the country. This was not a mosque, and it wasn't at Ground Zero. It was, yes, indeed, was close, but it wasn't at Ground Zero and wasn't a victory mosque. It was something to celebrate the multiculturalism and the contribution to actually counter the narrative of hate that the radical terrorists did bring upon New York and Washington, D.C. and the United States as a whole. She referred to the project as the Ground Zero Mosque, but in this summer, 2010, in the run-up to the election, you saw hysteria and protest around what was to be termed the erection of a victory mosque. This led to the rise of the fomenting of fear around an election around Ground Zero or the Cordoba Project or Park 51. The elections happened and the hysteria went away. The hysteria went away around the structure. However, the hysteria maintained within the mainstream. 2010, Oklahoma became the first state in the United States to pass a state-level constitutional amendment called State Question 755, banning Sharia law from being practiced in the state. Though the courts finally did strike down the law, it was the beginning of a nationwide movement that helped politicians present an anti-Muslim rhetoric to their base. Former Republican Majority Leader Newt Gingrich made Sharia law his project. And by September 2015, he actually said we should have a federal law that says Sharia cannot be recognized by the courts in the United States. And it started this campaign, which went into 23 states to pass anti-Sharia legislation. It was never about getting the legislation actually passed, but about creating hysteria around Islam and Muslims that ultimately led to changes within the political establishment, that there is a group of politicians who are trying to protect America from this thing called Sharia. There isn't a place in the country where Sharia is legislation. And so again, it's hysteria around Islam and Muslims that foments fear that leads individuals to ride into political office because they're going to protect American Americans from the encroaching threat of Islam. The 2012 presidential election was again, President Obama was reelected, but it was a response also to the rise of the Tea Party. The Tea Party arose in 2009, a year after he was elected, and by 2012, 10% of Americans identified them as members or part of the movement. Now, just to put it in scope, in terms of the progressive movement here in the United States today, it nowhere near captures those kinds of numbers. 10% of America identifying as part of the movement is huge. We also saw the Americans for Prosperity really funding this project of the Tea Party, funded through the Koch brothers. By 2019, the Republicans had dropped the language of Tea Party because now that had gone mainstream. We no longer needed an in the party separate connotation for those members. It had already gone mainstream. And by 2012, we saw the terms socialist and Islamist and Muslim Brotherhood infiltration become regularized in the conversation around the election of President Obama. So I'm going to come to what I want to focus on, which was the 2016 presidential election and Trump's vehicle really into office. On March 2011, Trump began a series of TV appearances. This is 5 years before he wins the presidency. TV appearances about his suspicions around Obama's non-Muslim origins. And this lasted for about 6 weeks, riling up much of the Republican base. It was galvanized by all the dog whistling undertones of the issue. The initial experiment propelled him to entry into the polls into the Republican field of candidates for that 2012 presidential election. And according to Gallup, the percentage of Americans who believed that Obama was definitely born outside of the United States was 47% at that period. So he was successful in getting 47% of Americans to believe that Barack Obama, their president, was indeed not born in the United States. This was the case after he was the president already, eventually choosing to address this fringe conspiracy by releasing his long-form birth certificate to the public. Trump had pushed the issue so hard that it even reached out to fringe figures on the right who published tracts about Obama's non-American birth. One of them even shot up to the Amazon sales charts. Such was the atmosphere created by Donald Trump at the time when the U.S. was experiencing a resurgence in anti-Muslim paranoia. He started his intrusion into the U.S. political spectrum like that. He came into politics questioning the birth and faith of President Obama. At its very inception, he conducted his invasion into his entrance into U.S. politics by using the vehicle of right wing, which ultimately becomes called alt-right, conspiracies shot with or filled with Islamophobia. And once the birther episode had run its course, he drops the issue, but it had already taken up a significant spot in the political arena and the American imagination. He soon begins to cultivate Republican figures and influential right-wing social circles that lead up to the 2012 election. He eventually decides not to seek the Republican nomination, but had already changed the political culture and discourse, both in Washington and throughout the country, and anti-Muslim conspiracies, which had been debunked historically a very long time ago, were now part of the basis for his 2015 run for office. He gradually but overtly pushes the fringe right-wing conspiracy into the mainstream that more formal Republican circles were willing to humor him and take his donations. But he even convinced at one point Mitt Romney on the campaign to accept his endorsement, and which further legitimized his position as a political figure in America. Again, Mitt Romney is not too fond of him today. Trump clinched this U.S. presidency in November of 2016, and it sent perhaps one of the greatest political shockwaves. It was unexpected, however, it had a long-term effect and an immediate effect. He was elected, and the next day, there was a firebombing at a mosque. His rise was orchestrated possibly by a coalition of actors that exploited the anger of the white working class and its litany of perceived socio-political grievances, as well as the increasing cohesion and solidification of such sentiments into corresponding political and, more importantly, an electoral constituency. And this will go on to have highly significant consequences for the perception of Islam and Muslims until today. What was formerly, or who were formerly marginalized, like figures in the alt-right, like Steve Bannon, now had direct influence from within the Trump campaign, and this is what I call the Bannon effect. Here we see that the background from which Trump's campaign rhetoric poured forth came from an ideological worldview that had been espoused by Steve Bannon for a very long time. He outlined his views regarding the threat of Islamic terrorism against the Judeo-Christian civilization and Western values in a 2014 speech. During that speech, he talked about how, whether the West would like it or not, was fighting a global war against jihadist Islamic fascism. He also said that the West was historically kept Islam out of the world by facing up to its expansion, and today the global war must carry on that same struggle. This is clearly articulated in his idea vis-a-vis Muslims and Islam, and Bannon carried that into the White House in January of 2017 when President Trump was initially inaugurated. So what are the social cultural effects of just that that time period, 2015, run up to the election, 2016, the year of the election, and that January 2017, the inauguration. The social cultural effects of this gradual process of mainstreaming what was wider on the periphery, now in the core. In that time period, about a month after the 2016 election, when 1,094 hate crimes were recorded by the Southern Poverty Law Center within 34 days of his election. For context, the FBI recorded 6,121 hate crimes for the entire year of 2016. And here we saw 1,094 in 1 month after his election, a 5-year high. 315 of those were anti-immigrant attacks, and 112 were explicitly violent acts against Muslims. In 1 month, 112 explicitly violent acts against Muslims in the United States. 37% of the total number were committed by individuals who directly referenced President Trump or his campaign. The background to these numbers is equally troubling, with hate crimes in the United States rising 10% from 2014 to 2016. Islamophobic incidents rose from 154 in 2014 to 307 in 2016. Moreover, the number of hate crimes primarily made up by white nationalists and far-right rose from 782 in 2014 to 917 in 2016, a historic high again. The most dramatic growth was the near tripling of anti-Muslim hate groups from 34 in 2015 to within 1 month of President Trump's election to 101. These are all according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. So you're seeing that the institutionalized hate is leading to violence, is leading to hate groups, and ultimately to more militias in the name of fear of Islam and Muslims and their entry into the public fore. This brings us to the Muslim ban. The first thing that President Trump did was the executive order called Muslim ban, or we call Muslim ban. Banning individuals from Iraq, Syria, Iran, Sudan, Libya, Somalia, and Yemen from entering the United States. Refugees were banned for 120 days, and Syrian refugees were banned indefinitely. That was the first manifestation of the ban. It took on Muslim ban point 2, Muslim ban 3, and now we have a different ban that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Even though the Muslim ban was stopped by federal courts, it began with the language of, "We don't want them here." That was the president's language. We don't want them here. Yet the tone and reputation of those statements led to the beginnings and the infusion of anti-Muslim dog whistling in all policy moves tied to immigration, tied to social change, and tied to Muslims. Even though it was stopped by federal courts before emerging through a number of changes and iterations, the initial move from the White House to push such a thinly veiled, uncompromised, anti-immigrant policy dovetailed perfectly with the entire campaign that brought him into office, that he was going to get tough on terror, get terrorism, meaning Muslims, excessive immigration, and crime. And he sees the three intersecting based on one group. Of course, tied to it, increasing immigration from the southern border. By December 2015, not long after the tragic shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, he states that there should be a complete shutdown on Muslims coming into the United States. And the Muslim ban seemed to actually be the articulation of this. The New York Times explained that the Trump Bannon vision of Islam in the West in an article in 2017 saying that The first iteration of the Muslim ban is the worldview that stems from the Clash of Civilization thesis by political scientist Samuel Huntington, and combines the straightforward warnings about extreme violence and broad brush critiques of Islam. It sometimes conflates terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State with largely non-violent groups as the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoot at times, and now with the 1.7 billion Muslims around the world. So ultimately what we're seeing is what used to be language around terrorist groups to all groups, and now to all Muslims, all in the same category. And this takes me to what I mean when I say the public-private double talk. And again, I'm being very deliberate in my language on double talk, because that is the accusation made to most Islamists. And here, is there a public-private double talk? In a 2017 Pew survey, it showed that on the scale of 0 to 100, 100 being the warmest and most approving, Islam scored 48 for a large sample size. This is, again, behind a lot of religions, but it seems that the public is not really clear, or we're not really clear on where the public stands and the complete influence of this. And so when we think about the weaponization of speech, the weaponization of double talk, and ultimately what's happening here, the defense or pursuit of free speech and expression on a whole has been co-opted by factions in the far right for their foremost concerns, and this has been one of the greatest consequences. What they say in public is very different than what they say in private. And so there can be the, no, what are you talking about? Everything is fine. Then you see the publications that stem from within their organizations that lead for us to read into it a two-faced approach. And these documents are what we find in a lot of the Breitbart news, again, founded by Steve Bannon, a senior advisor to the president as he came into office. And so this language of promoting something separate in the public, but also saying something very different in the private, and the political objective is to get the private anti-Muslim language to permeate through the public, is the ultimate doublespeak that we start to see in this public-private ruse that's now under the guise of, or for then under the guise of, freedom of speech. So let's talk really briefly about who the president decided to surround himself with as soon as he came into office. And this is what I call the path to power. How did those who are fundamentally on the margins now come into the Oval Office? It wasn't just Bannon. Trump's national security advisor, albeit very briefly, called Islamism, Michael Flynn called Islamism a vicious cancer. And he's on the board of advisors of Act for America, an anti-Muslim organization, and listed as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And he was, for a time period, the national security advisor to the president. Stephen Miller, who still serves as a senior advisor to Trump, who along with Bannon was the co-architect of the Muslim ban, worked with right-wing activists and several authors to organize Islamofascism Awareness Week on university campuses. He's a good friend of Richard Spencer, and he's someone who continuously works on the language of the southern border and the infestation from the south. And I'll talk more about this language of infestation towards the end. Sebastian Gorka, who for a while was Trump's deputy assistant, has links to the European far right, and once noted how violence is a fundamental aspect of Islam. And these are just a few of the figures that surrounded the president into his entry into office. 2018 midterm election is a completely separate ballgame, because we actually saw candidates who were Muslim women, visibly Muslim women, running for office. And what did the president say about them? Go back to your broken, crime-infested countries. Now, Representative Omar is a refugee from Somalia who did rise to the ranks in politics and run for a seat that had been held by another Muslim member of the House, and she won that seat. Now, Representative Rashida Tlaib from Michigan is born in the United States. She actually rose to the political ranks as someone who came from the basics and moved up the political establishment, had a very long track record of political activity in the United States and elected office. Their elections were very different, and they're part of a different project that I'm working on. But what I wanted to mention about them is how they were lumped together as a threat, but how one was juxtaposed against the other. And what I find is that Rashida, being a Palestinian Muslim woman, born in the United States, elected by a district that's not majority Muslim, that's not majority Arab, came to be seen as a greater threat, that she was a hidden Muslim, more threatening because she doesn't look seemingly Muslim. Again, the idea that even she should return to her broken and crime-infested country as someone who was born and raised in the United States is a very interesting juxtaposition of language, that no matter what, the other, the brown, the Muslim, cannot be part of the political fabric of the United States. And this takes me to today, the heart of the current argument. I know that yesterday you had a long lecture from one of my dear colleagues that I've learned so much from about COVID and what it's done for democracies and authoritarian regimes. So I won't repeat what Dr. Fahmy had said, but what I will focus on is what the dog whistling that is occurring today from that political establishment and media nexus could be leading to. So on the eve of Ramadan, just a few days ago, President Trump pledged a temporary ban on the immigration to the United States. And he talked about the invisible enemy of coronavirus. And he says, in the light of the attack from the invisible enemy, we as well need to protect the jobs of our great American citizens. I will be signing an executive order to temporarily suspend immigration into the United States. Now, recalling, it was just a few weeks ago where the State Department issued a call for medical practitioners to come from throughout the world, including the Middle East, to the United States because there was a lack of medical practitioners. And so here we saw this temporary ban on immigration to the United States because of the invisible enemy. The disease sparked sparked a lot of anger. And so tying it to jobs and tying it to immigration is part of his response to angry Americans that want the economy opened. I will protect you from them over there coming to infest our country. Here you have a critical juncture where, as of today, 52,000 Americans have died. Almost 1 million have been infected. The economy is closed and in some ways crippled. Oil prices have gone in places we haven't seen them before. World leaders are agonizing over the economy, about restrictions, how we can reopen it. And President Trump's response to his angry citizens is about suspending immigration. Again, last week, the week before Ramadan, he retweets a right-wing individual saying that, let's see if authorities enforce social distancing orders for mosques during Ramadan like they did to churches during Easter, as if Muslims would get special treatment, as if they do anyway. And here, when the president retweets this, he foments in American society that, wait, this population is different and is treated differently. And this takes us to today. It's no secret that Asian Americans have really felt the brunt of the hate and the backlash against coronavirus in the United States. You don't need to look further than Twitter to see Asian Americans telling their experiences about violence, anger, being yelled at, racism, hateful attacks. And according to data analysts, there have been at least 100 per day in the United States because of the language of the president around coronavirus being an Asian virus, being the Wuhan virus, coming from those people over there. We should have kept them over there. The ban worked. Again, he talked about a ban this week. The first case found in the United States was January 20th. The ban is in response to something public, not to something and all tied to the coronavirus. We also see the rise of Muslims seeing the end result of hate. We see an increasing Islamophobic web intrusion on Zoom calls, where the Zoom calls are being infiltrated by anti-Muslim or Islamophobic sentiment. We saw a Tunisian American healthcare worker who was wearing a mask, who works with COVID-19 positive patients. He was actually tasered for wearing a mask while shopping for groceries in Michigan. Media coverage of first responders, has been very interesting. Here in the New York Post is a story about a Muslim firefighter who got coronavirus when a Hasidic teen sneezed onto his face. And in the article, it was framed that this is a Muslim firefighter, a Muslim first responder who had been on the front lines of the war against COVID, and he was referred to as the son of a terrorist by the New York Post. Again, stripping him of what he's been doing in this fight against the coronavirus. We know, and we are still gathering the data, that Muslim Americans are on the front lines of the war against the coronavirus as doctors and first responders and nurses, and in concentrations like the state of New Jersey where I live, where there's a heavy concentration of Muslim physicians. They've not only been on the front line, many of them have been infected, a few have died, and several have been infected, recovered, and gone right back to work. And so the contribution of Muslims in the fight against coronavirus is not reflected in the coverage of coronavirus. And this takes me back to that symbiotic relationship today. So one of the first articles talking about Puerto Rico, part of the United States, it says, the latest, Puerto Rico sees its first case of coronavirus. And what do you see in this slideshow, the fixed image? It's of a masjid in Jakarta, linking rise of coronavirus to a masjid in Jakarta. And when subsequently ABC News picks up the story, they only put the picture of the masjid in Jakarta, again, making a connection between coronavirus and the United States and mosques. Here you have an article from Yahoo News. A Seattle lab uncovered Washington's coronavirus outbreak after defying federal only after defying federal regulation. And what do you see? A halal restaurant with a falafel sign. Again, a connection between Islam and Muslims with the coronavirus. BBC News. Borders shut as coronavirus cases rise, and you see a Muslim woman with hijab with her face covered. Again, it's not clear the direct connection between the image and the title, but what's happening is the fomenting of fear around coronavirus tied to, again, symbols of Islam and Muslims, dehumanizing Islam and Muslims, and it's about borders being shut as coronavirus cases rise. Coronavirus, cancel your haircut, facial, pedicure appointments. Subheading, what is the difference between bacteria and viruses? And you have a young Muslim woman in hijab. What this image has to do with this, for a while, some of my colleagues and I were making jokes like, we've finally have Muslim representation in the media, and these random pictures of Muslim women, wow, they're finally being perceived of as average Americans, but why is it constantly in these stories about the coronavirus? Coronavirus, Europe shuts down schools as markets tumble and sport in crisis. And what is the image of? 5 Muslim men praying in full quarantine gear and 95 masks. The title is Europe shuts schools as markets tumble and sport in crisis. And the image is of a group of 5 Muslim men making salah. And I know this story was really big in Turkey. Trump suspends travel from Europe for 30 days. And what is the image of Turkey? And I believe that's the Blue Mosque. CNN International also picks up Austria announces first death from the coronavirus, a country that has 302 confirmed cases according to the health ministry, and picks up what? An image of a mosque. We saw many images of mosques from Istanbul as the symbols of Trump suspending travel from Europe for 30 days. And if you think about it, it was the first time Western media wanting to insist that Turkey is a Western country. So, what does all of this mean? We know that this symbiotic relationship between individuals, media, and interest groups is not perfect. I know it's not perfect, but there's something there happening to the story, because ultimately Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment is being weaponized as a political tool to change the political narrative and gain entry into elected office. The question is, why does it work? And why does it work so well? What makes Islamophobia a publicly acceptable form of racism and bigotry? We know it's not just happening here. We know it's also happening in France and in India and throughout Eastern and Western Europe and now Latin America and even aspects of the Middle East. And so here we're seeing that Islamophobia becomes a publicly acceptable form of racism and bigotry that allows individuals, media outlets, and interest groups to change the political narrative and ultimately the political establishment. Now, I have a few final thoughts on language. We talk about alt-right because it was a white nationalist, Richard Spencer, who actually launched a magazine or a web magazine called The Alternative Right. And so they launched the term themselves, and he was trying to disseminate his ideas. The alt-right is a white nationalist racist movement, and part of its membership is really about supporting anti-immigrationist policies to ensure the continuation of the white majority in the United States. Others call for the breakup of the country to form a white separatist ethno-nation state in North America. But even white nationalism is wrong because it's really about immigration and citizenship and who belongs and racial segregation and state-sanctioned discrimination. But I think the correct term for what we're seeing rising from within this movement that's touching the political establishment is the rise of the white power movement. White power is really about the race war. This is the activism that thinks about white nationalism, not in the context of the nation state, but in the context of an Aryan nation that transcends boundaries, that moves from Europe to the United States, to Europe. We have manifestos, and in many of these manifestos by these white nationalists or members of white power movements, or even the white nationalists who shot up the mosque in New Zealand, in all of their manifestos is the language of eliminating the other, of a greater Aryan race, of something that goes beyond national borders. And so when we think about what all of this means together, especially in the era of COVID-19, we're starting to see the intersection of racial, ethnic, religious politics, the rise of hate movements, the co-opting of social ills to use Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment to actually be able to change the narrative and the political establishment. And I hope during the Q&A we can talk about if this has ever happened in history or what this is a greater reflection of. But this is, again, not just a US phenomenon, not just a European phenomenon. This is rising throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dalia. That was a great lecture, and really thank you so much for taking your time to join us. I know it was 8:30 a.m. when we started this lecture over there, so I'm very impressed by by you being able to give this lecture at this time of the day. So I do have actually a couple of questions here in line for you. And I will just basically read them, and then you can take a couple of minutes per question to answer, and then we will move forward. For those who are listening, you can ask your questions. You can write the questions by clicking. There is, like, in the middle of the screen, you can see a button with two speech bubbles and a question mark. That's where you can write your question, and it reaches me as the moderator, and then I will pick them from there. So first question is here. Yelena is asking, Salam, the Pew Research Center makes very reliable surveys around the world annually. Why do people of mass media prefer fake data? Is it an indicator of the nature of the contemporary media or the human nature in general? What do you think?
It's a great question, and I want to be clear that I'm not making generalizations about all media. I was making a very specific claim about a very specific segment of the media that's created for the purpose of the dissemination of anti-Muslim rhetoric. So they will take Pew data, even Pew data, and mismanage it or manipulate it to reflect their own agenda. And so I wasn't talking about mainstream media as a whole, because there are many wonderful media outlets, many neutral media outlets that do take data and do with it what it should be done. But what I was talking about is those who create data and those who manipulate data, and that they are part of that three-part nexus that creates that symbiotic relationship that leads to the mainstreaming of anti-Muslim sentiment. Now, historically, media outlets like Breitbart News were outside of the mainstream. But slowly, with the election of President Trump, they were referred to as if they were mainstream media, when historically they're not. And we see this kind of articulation today with even outlets that are mainstream, like Fox News, being referred to as the pulpit of the kind of national stream pulpit that we see in third world countries of the president.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer. Now there is a next one from an anonymous friend from London, actually. So this question goes, which trends, wait a second, because what are counter-currents we can support or need to develop to push back against the Islamophobic trends? And then he was also clarifying his question, saying that he means, for example, the growth of Islamophobia across media, politics, entertainment, and interest of groups. He actually also suggested a couple of counter sort of currents or measures himself. I will just list them and then we can discuss. So first, high visibility media personalities of Muslim faith, maybe. Senators, congressmen of Muslim faith. Grassroots social interaction and community integration activities, Islamophobia watchdog organizations, economic and business representation, or even positive representation in Hollywood. What do you think about these?
I think those are all wonderful. I should have said at the outset that the beginning part of this project is a part of a study and a report I did for the Atlantic Council. And in my policy recommendations, many of what you said are suggested. Yes, a watchdog group, and there are, and they're rising. They're not as sophisticated as other groups, as for example, the ADC, but what we do have are other groups that are rising to account for this. High visibility, you know, I know Mehdi Hassan is a Brit, but he lives in the United States, and I think individuals like him and Dr. Abdurrahman on CNN are not allowing for anti-Muslim rhetoric to go unnoticed, right? They're actually calling it out and creating information around that. Muslims in the media, absolutely increasing representation in Hollywood. We're starting to see more and more of that. But I think one of the greatest, so if here's anti-Muslim sentiment, one of the greatest mitigators, so according to the average American, according to a Gallup study, 67% of Americans have a negative association with the word Islam, right? So it's not that they hate it, but when they hear the word Islam, they have a negative association of it. That's almost 70% of the population. But the one thing that mitigates it, that brings it down to the 20s from almost 70, is if they know or encounter a Muslim. If you know or encounter a Muslim, that's the greatest mitigator to reducing the negative sentiment on the word Islam. And so what that means is that the average American, the average Westerner, at least here in the United States, I know we have different stats for Europe, has never met a Muslim. And so the greatest mitigator of the misperception is encountering and getting to know a Muslim. You can't hate what you know.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with you on that one, indeed. Now, let's see. Yelena has another question. Don't all those facts that Dr. Dalia gives prove that the US democracy is such only on the surface and in the Constitution? People are not equal in their rights in the face of their politicians. And she thinks that Trump is a logical outcome of this.
So the United States has never been a full democracy. It's always been a project, right, moving towards democracy. Are there moments in history where it was much more democratic? Yes. Are we moving into a moment where there is both a rise in anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment, hate, white nationalism, and militias in the United States? Yes, but there's also a rise in Muslim running for office, Muslims working in media representation, Muslims working in Hollywood. And so, the jury is still out on the long-term effects of this. We are definitely feeling the heat of it. And according to the FBI, 2020, this year, and this is before COVID, 2020, this year, the run-up to the November election is considered, this was published in 2019, saying that 2020 would be the most violent year for Muslims in the United States because of the run-up to the 2020 election. Has that led Muslims to lead docile lives? No, on the contrary. More are running for office, more are moving in the public, more are reaching out to their neighbors and community service activities. Yes, they might not be highlighted, but at least we're watchdogging this.
Thank you. Next question was posed by Taimur. He asks, what do you think is the source of strength for Muslim Americans against this state-owned Islamophobia? As we know, Muslim majority states have capacity to condemn Indian Islamophobic atrocities, but when it comes to Trump, there is a policy of burying his head in the sand.
So this is an interesting question. When we get to the 2018 election of Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, there were very separate attacks on the two of them, and they came from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So Islamophobia is an industry. It's an industry that's heavily funded, between $50 and $250 million a year. And there's also foreign support for it. And so what Muslims around the world need to recognize is that you're not fighting something that's abstract. You're fighting something that has a political objective. And the political objective is the marginalization for Muslims from civic and political life. That we internalize this narrative and we say, we don't really belong. Now, if you think about it generationally, I was born in the States in the 1970s. I remember the Iran hostage crisis, but I never felt the deep fundamental othering that children are experiencing as Muslim Americans in the United States today, that their identity is fundamentally questioned. Is that leading to a response where people are then picking up the mantle to answer these deeper questions? Yes, but there's something more important happening here, and it's not just happening in the United States and throughout Europe and Latin America and the Middle East, especially certain Gulf countries, and of course in India. And what's happening in the United States in terms of the coronavirus is much more violent against Muslims in India, who are seen or labeled the cause, as well as Muslims and minority groups in France today, right? 3 countries who have very similar anti-Muslim narratives. So absolutely, I agree with you in certain aspects, but I don't fully agree with you in that there has to be an understanding that this is not just a random phenomenon, but it's a concerted effort. And once we understand the concertedness of the effort, we will have to actually fundraise and put an equally or even more so investigative capacity to counter this concerted effort to minimize the effects of the internalization of Islamophobia by young Muslims themselves.
Thank you. Since you were talking about the authorization of children that you yourself witnessed, one attendee asked if there is a way to humanize the other. What do you think about the humanization of the other?
It's very, very easy, and I've given lectures about this. It's very, very easy to blame everything on the Trump supporter. It's very easy to dehumanize and mock the Trump supporter. I think what we need to understand is that all otherings come from either misunderstanding, the deep dog whistling, or an underbelly that needs to be understood. Racism has a very deeply entrenched history in the United States. And what we encounter as Muslims or minority groups or immigrants is nothing compared to what African Americans continue to endure in this country. Our struggle is fundamentally built on their struggle. And we can't deny that the West, whether Europe in its colonial era or the United States and its slavery time period and its institutionalized racism against blacks in this country, if we don't understand how deeply connected our stories are, then we're not actually fighting the right battle. It has to be a complete restructuring how we understand power and justice. You know, we talk about, or I teach my students about negative power, negative justice, and positive power, positive justice. You know, we talk about freedom and liberty. Well, freedom from oppression brings you from negative power to 0.0, right? Or negative freedom to 0.0. I'm still being freed from something. But freedom to do something is when we start to break down the structures of injustice. We are still in the negative space. We're still fighting from, right? We are looking for freedoms from injustice, freedoms from Islamophobia, freedom from institutionalized racism, freedom from bigotry. And so when we're still in the negative space, the struggle to move on to freedom to is tied to the kind of pulling down into the negative freedom from space. Our struggle is tied to the struggles of others. And one thing we're realizing in the past couple of years, especially in the post-Trump election era, is that Muslim activists throughout the world are starting to ally with all other marginalized groups. That this is a struggle for all of us. Justice is not about just us, right? Justice has to be for all.
Thank you. That was a very, very good point that you brought in there with these negative freedoms and negative power. I myself haven't thought about it like this before, so thank you. Well, when we're talking about overlapping struggles and sort of like whether we're going to get out of this negative space or not, there is one attendee that asks quite critically, we have seen certain Muslim circles flirting with right-wing governments, especially in the US. Has this move in some way affected Islamophobia in the country?
You mean, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the entirety of the question. You mean like Muslim majority countries or leaders of Muslim majority countries aligning with President Trump? Because that's absolutely what we've seen, right? So we see, for example, President Trump has a favorite dictator, the current president of Egypt, who came to power through a military coup. He has a favorite world leader in Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. And so we think about the traditional notions of relationships with powers, even in places like the Middle East, the fact that Middle Eastern countries are not just aligning with the United States, but also being part of the project of the marginalization of the Muslim diaspora community in the United States means that again, as I said, the Islamophobia industry and Islamophobia power also has support in the leadership of several Muslim majority countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, definitely.
Okay, thank you so much. I have so many questions. I'm like overwhelmed with the flow of questions right now. So I'm just, for everybody who is just...
We can take like 4 or 5 together and I can maybe answer them together if you have so many.
Yeah, because, I'm scrolling through the questions and trying to see if they are related to each other or not. And some of them are rather like statement-like, so I have to really filter out something. So for everybody who is listening right now, really I'm doing my best in taking all of your questions into consideration. But we do have 15 minutes only more left, so we will see what happens, okay? All right. Well, let's see. There is a question related to COVID-19. This is from Dilek. She said that she noticed that you kept talking about the war against COVID-19. It is not difficult to use these terms, especially when we know what words have done for you. So it's like, I guess Dilek is sort of like referring to war on terror and war against COVID.
Yes. No, I was deliberate in my use of the language war on COVID, because that's what our administration is saying today, and that there's fundamental implications for that. So if you use language like the war on COVID, then China is the enemy, right? And you can start to also use othering language against the Chinese. And so the language of war is stuff that is language I'm using deliberately here. Just as I said in the start of the talk, I'm going to say, and the future of American democracy, or the future of the liberal tradition, right? Because when we do these analyses on our own societies, that's the language that's used. I remember being, actually when I was presenting this research for the first time at the Atlantic Council, a member of the audience said something, in the middle of his question was, the Arab street. Can you explain the Arab street? Why is it, and he said this is a convenient term we have. I said, why is it okay for us to refer to the Arab peoples as one person, as the Arab street, but we can't refer to the American street? I can't talk about a neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville being the American street. Saying that is ridiculous. But when we use this language against ourselves, I'm being very deliberate in entering the realm of the vernacular and problematizing the way we study the Middle East, the way we study Muslim majority countries and societies, and turning the language on us, on ourselves as Americans, as American analysts, of why do we continue to use these terms, but we are very uncomfortable turning the terms on ourselves. The rise of anti-Muslim sentiment and the future of American democracy, the future of liberalism. The war on COVID, what are the implications of this? How parallel is it to the war on terror? The war on hunger? Again, I'm using the language very deliberately because the consequences are systematically the same.
Okay, thank you for that. Next question that I will take from the line, actually. By the way, there is a participant from, I think from Brazil. She is a participant studying Islamophobia in Brazil, but didn't hear all of your speech completely. So first of all, can you just define Islamophobia? Like, what is the definition that you use for Islamophobia? This is the first question. And then I'm going to ask the second question straight forward also, which is a participant from UK says, thank you for a deeply enlightening and resonant session. This reflects many of our experiences in the UK, and in particular the securitization of the political sphere, as well as the infiltration of this discourse into education practice, even at grassroots level. Prevent agenda, you also know about this. Is this something that you can expand a little on, please?
Sure.
So, yeah.
The first one, Islamophobia, is the irrational fear of Islam and Muslims. It has a political objective, and that's the marginalization of Muslims from civic and political life. So it's not just the irrational fear and hysteria, the way we usually use the term, but acknowledging that there is an objective here, and that's the marginalization of Muslims from civic and political life. I'm not a UK expert, but absolutely the trends are very similar. Prevent in the UK and CVE in the United States. CVE was different under the Obama administration. Today it's really Muslim surveillance, even though, according to the FBI, the #1 threat facing the homeland is the rise of right-wing militias. Now, the Muslim experience in the United States is a lot different than the Muslim experience in the UK, because your Muslim experience is much more deeply tied to the hate of immigrants narrative. The immigrants are primarily from Muslim majority countries. The rise of, again, 2008 was not just the rise of, the Muslim threat, but it was also the first time the Hispanic vote was a swing vote that changed a lot of election turnout or election results. And so our anti-immigrant is really about the southern border with Mexico, while your anti-immigrant is also compoundedly Muslim. In the United States, save the African American community, the Muslim community is much more upper middle class than the Muslim community in the UK. And so that lends it to the language of ghettoization of Muslim communities in the UK, no-go zones in terms of Muslim areas in the UK. This is language that doesn't necessarily exist in the United States historically. It might be entering the vernacular, but it's very different. Your experience is also tied to the deepness of the fear of immigration, especially when the European Union was founded, when nationals can cross borders. I know the Eurobarometer since I think 2001, 2002, the fear of losing identity in the growth of the Europeanness is something that was also part of the story. And so although there's a lot of overlap, I believe your story is actually a lot worse. It's compounded by the immigration issue, by the entry of the European Union, and then of course Brexit narrative. While the United States, it's Muslims, and then tied to that immigration from the southern border.
Thank you for that. I'm also going to ask 2 questions again. I decided on this new method since there are so many questions, so I will just ask 2 questions. I find these personally very interesting as well. So Sundus is asking, Salam, thank you for the lecture, Ms. Dalia. How do you think this issue will continue to manifest itself, if at all, as the 2020 presidential race goes forward and culminates in November? So a little bit future perspective here. And then there is an interesting question by an anonymous attendee. Does the hate propagated each of Muslim individual is the same kind of a hate, or is there a dichotomy between progressive Muslim and conservative Muslims? So this is an interesting one.
That's a great question, yeah.
Yeah.
The first one was, what do we see coming down the pike for 2020? Again, before COVID, the FBI itself said 2020 will be the most violent year for Muslims in the United States because it's an election year. And as we said, the hate ebbs and flows, right? The hate ebbs and flows around an election, but the alt-right rises and continues to rise. So while Islamophobia is cyclical, hate continues to rise because of the mainstreaming of the narrative. And so we're still moving in a direction of increased hate and increased violence. We hope not, but with this compounded economic situation because of COVID, I mean, you must be seeing all over the world footage of protests in the United States, the fomenting of not just fear of the other, but that closing the country is against rights. Women's liberation is no longer about freedom of their body, but freedom to not wear a mask. I mean, the language coming from elements of society are really going to question how deeply rooted the elements of liberalism are, the elements of democracy are, the elements of equality, of freedom, whether or not this is an inclusive nation, whether this is a endemically racist nation. And these are questions that we will have to reckon with as a country in terms of how we identify ourselves. The second question was, are progressive versus liberal Muslims, which ones are more bad than the other? You know, there's no greater lesson learned from the wars of the breakdown of former Yugoslavia, in that you are awakened into the identity that you're hated for. And so you might consider yourself a liberal Muslim, a progressive Muslim, a Muslim in private, a Muslim by name, but the violence committed against Muslims, especially in places like Serbia and Kosovo and Bosnia, did not discriminate against who was visibly versus non-visibly. It's about in-group, out-group dynamic, and who belongs to the in-group and who does not. White nationalists don't discriminate based on are Middle Easterners white, right? We are going through the US Census right now where they count populations, and historically Middle Easterners are counted as white. we now have a new category where you can write in your place of ethnic origin. And so you're counted as white so that your economic progress, your level of education, your productivity can enter into the white category, but technically you're never perceived as white. And so this idea of progressive versus liberal does not really matter when the hate is of the other.
Thank you. Well, I have one question here also from Jalal. He says, in his recent article, Randall Schweller said that, and this is quote, "The US is experiencing today a societal cultural revolution with her multiple races and cultures, which made Americans without a common national narrative, as the American historians have stopped writing about the nation for decades," according to the journalist Jill Lepore, end of quote. His question is, do you think that rise of nationalism there will be in favor of the unity of the country, especially with the rise of the new rival powers? And Muslims there are just normal victims of this white nationalism, just the same as the blacks and the Latinos?
So nationalism is a term that we have to define and talk about, like ethno-nationalism and what these terms mean. If we're talking about who belongs to the nation, so the idea of nation stems from the idea that this is a group that has a shared common ancestry, a shared language, a shared heritage, and that exists throughout most of the world. Now, the United States, not being a nation in its founding that was of a group with a shared history, the way nationalism or national identity was defined to us even as children is in terms of manifest destiny, that we have a shared future, a shared common purpose. And so we might not have shared ancestry, but we have shared common purpose. That story is the story that's being challenged today. That version of national identity. We're starting to see the rise of who belongs to the nation and who's excluded from the nation. And it's no longer based on if you were born or not in the United States. Even the birthright, which is part of historic in the U.S. Constitution, if you're born in the United States, you are an American. Part of the rise of the Tea Party, and today President Trump wants to remove the birthright notion of citizenship even. Even in this COVID-19 era where there's a stimulus package that the average working class American can get $1,200, that only exists if both members of a married couple are indeed U.S. citizens with Social Security numbers. If one is not, they don't get counted as Americans who deserve anything from the stimulus, even if everyone's paying taxes. And so we're starting to see the language of who belongs to the nation and who's excluded from the nation creep into not just the vernacular, but ultimately into policy here in the United States.
Thank you so much. We have only 5 more minutes left, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to make my last announcements. But so this is about building alliances. So Muslims have a certain affinity with the alt-right in the face of neoliberalism, for instance, in terms of religiosity. Is there enough room to overcome Islamophobia and for the traditionalist right-wingers to ally with Muslims in the near future?
So we're presuming that this is about religious conservatism.
Yes.
It's not. This is not about religious conservatism. Conservatism, look, this is a secular nation. You never want the state to articulate religion. And you never want religion to be the basis on which you form alliances in terms of conservatism. We can't look at, for example, the evangelicals in the United States and say, this is the conservative movement. Because how are we defining conservatism here? Anti-abortion? Or caring for your neighbor? The top conservatives do not talk about caring for their neighbor, caring for the elderly, caring for the downtrodden, caring for children in cages on the southern border. I think we need to be very careful about how we use conservatism, assuming that conservatism is a natural religious alliance. It is fundamentally not.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, because like indeed even we have had this question a lot of times in other conferences as well, and with friends we also discuss this issue a lot, so thank you for the clarification. Now I cannot unfortunately anymore take questions because we're running out of time. I thank everybody for this very interactive session, and my special thanks of course goes to Dr. Dalia for taking her time to join us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Dalia, really, and I hope to see you soon again in Istanbul in one of our conferences. Now, I would like to remind those who are attending the session that tomorrow the next lecture in our webinar series is going to be given by Dr. Monzer Kaf. He's a lecturer at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, and he's going to talk about how to reform the finance sector. And also, if you missed any part of this lecture, or if you just want to come back to this or any of our other lectures later on, then we will post the recordings on SIGA's YouTube channel as we get through the edits. So this was it for today, dear friends, for our Sunday. Here in Istanbul, we are waiting to have our iftar in about 3 hours. I'm already quite hungry, and I hope that Dr. Dalia is going to get a good rest after this in the States.